Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Mark Baldassare, and I'm the President and CEO and the Director of the PPIC Statewide Survey at the Public Policy Institute of California. We're very pleased to be presenting this program today. For those of you who aren't familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan think tank based in San Francisco and Sacramento. Today's event is part of the James Irvine Foundation briefing series, and we would like to thank them for making today's program possible. And I would like to doubly thank them because they also help support the research. And if it wasn't for their support, we wouldn't be here having a free lunch today, and we wouldn't be talking about a new report from PPIC. So good to have their funding to help us engage on this important topic. So I'm going to very briefly present the findings of the new report, since I'm also the author of it, California's Exclusive Electorate, Who Votes and Why It Matters, a copy of which you'll find on your chair, and you can also look on our website today and find a copy of the survey and the report as well. There are more copies in the back in case you want to bring them to your friends afterwards. Following my presentation, I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the esteemed panel that we have here today about the challenges of voter registration and voter turnout and civic engagement in California. A couple more things before we begin. Later today, you'll receive a short survey via email. And we ask that you please take a few moments to let us know what you thought about this event. We read those results, and it helps us plan future events, so please do that. And reminder for not just you, but for myself, this happened in the movie theater the other night for me. Quite embarrassing. Please turn off your cell phone. I learned my lesson. So now on to the report findings. This is a report which looks at the fact that in California, for over the last 100 years, through our initiative process, citizens make very critical policy decisions at the ballot box. And so we look with interest at what the characteristics and preferences of citizens are in this state, especially those who vote, because they drive public policy to such a large degree in our state. And we find in this study that California's electorate does not reflect the state's diversity, but not just the demographic diversity. It does not reflect the attitudes or preferences that are seen among those people who are not part of the electorate who live in California today. And there are millions of people who are not part of the electorate. For us, the important thing is that we did a study very similar to this 10 years ago. We replicated those findings in this report, found very similar patterns. What's different about this study today compared to 10 years ago is that a very important theme that comes out in the research and in the differences between the electorate and those people who aren't part of the electorate today is the economic and political inequality, themes that you're hearing a lot about both on the Democratic and Republican side in the presidential election this year. So that is, basically what I'm going to show you in a few slides. And I want to tell you a little bit about what information we drew on for this study. We looked at the Secretary of State's voter registration and election statistics going back to October 2000, and then the most recent numbers from January 2016. So the end of the 2000 election cycle and the beginning of the 2016, both presidential years. We look at demographic and economic trends that are provided to us from both the census and the California Department of Finance. But mostly, we look at the the profiles and public opinion from the monthly surveys that we conducted last year. We interviewed almost 12,000 people over the course of 12,000 adults over the course of the last year during our 7 monthly surveys. So we look at the information gathered from all of those surveys and then some individual results to show some examples of differences between those who vote and those who are not part of the electorate. The focus of this study then is on the differences in the views and the preferences between what we define as the likely voters, people who are registered voters who through a series of responses in those surveys tell us that they are frequent voters, and those people who are not registered to vote, those adults who are not registered to vote, who in this study we call the non-voters. So what do we know about the trends between 2000 and 2016? We know that there have been a pretty stable percentage and pretty high percentage of all adults who are eligible to vote, that has continued to fall pretty short of the numbers who are actually registered to vote. And then there's been a declining participation in the major parties, Democratic and Republican Party, over time. And our registration figures then reflecting who actually votes in election voters. We know in our 2014 election, the last statewide election, we had record low turnout. So participation in voting has lagged. These are just some of the basic numbers that we see from 2000 and where they stand today. All adults in California, there are about 30 million. Of those who are eligible to vote, that is citizens who are eligible to vote in California, 24.6. That means there are about 5.5 million, 5.5 million roughly, adults who live in California who are not currently eligible to vote. They could be either documented or undocumented, and our estimates are somewhere around 50-50 in terms of the documented versus undocumented. And so some numbers of those voters could become citizens, or adults could become citizens and vote, but aren't currently. Then how many people are actually registered to vote? 17.3 million. So we see about 7.3 million of those adults who are actually eligible who are not registered to vote today. So there's another 7.3 million. And then how many people are registered in the major parties? About 12.2 million, as I mentioned, down somewhat from where we were in 2000. So if we look at the trends in presidential elections during this millennium so far, that's where we make the statement from that there will be about half of the adults, at least, in this election who won't participate. As you see what happened in 2000, pretty similar, 11.1 out of the 24.8 million didn't vote. What's important about these trends is not just the raw numbers, but what's behind those numbers. And what's behind those numbers are, first of all, a likely voter group that is very different from the people who are not registered to vote in this state. Roughly 60%, based on our surveys of the last year, are white non-Hispanic. Roughly 60% of those who are not registered to vote are Latino in our state. And this isn't new. These are ongoing trends that we've seen in our surveys over time. But the likely voters tend to be much more affluent, more likely to be college graduates, have high incomes, and be homeowners compared to people who are not registered to vote. And I might add that in questions in which we ask people about what social class do they belong to, and do they describe themselves as economic haves or have-nots, or big differences that we note. Most people who are likely voters describe themselves as part of the haves, and most people who are non-voters describe themselves as the have-nots. But importantly for us, in a state where we make so much public policy by the ballot box, what we focus on is the difference between voters and non-voters. And a number of the surveys that we took over the course of the year on the question of should the government do more to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor, likely voters and non-voters about equally likely to say there are differences between, that there is this growing trend of a gap between the rich and the poor, but a big difference between the likely voters and the not likely voters about whether the government should be doing something. And big differences in the those who say that all people today that the government should do more to make sure that all Californians have an equal opportunity to get ahead between the likely voters and those who are not registered to vote. This was a particularly stark difference in public opinion on whether there was the percent who favored health coverage for undocumented immigrants in California. Among the likely voters, 42%, among those not registered, 75%. And in each case, you see here that the all adults somewhere in between, but in this case, a majority of all adults saying we should provide health coverage, but falling far short of the majority for likely voters. And on the issue of government spending, likely voters are much more likely to say that the state has a budget problem than those who are not registered to vote. On education funding, those who are not registered to vote, 20 points greater likelihood of saying that they favor a bond measure for school construction projects. So those are just some examples, and here's one for our elected officials on the panel today that I thought they would like. Those who are not registered to vote actually are more approving of the legislature than the likely voters. So, you know, maybe there's a reason to want to increase the electorate there, right? 46% said that they approve of the legislature among not registered voters. Only 29% saying they disapprove. Likely voters, a different group. So we'll be interested to get your opinions on that later. Let me just say one thing before I close this and mention that these aren't just trends we saw last year. These were trends we saw last week. We released a survey which had a question in it about whether you wanted a smaller government with fewer services or a bigger government with more services. Among the likely voters in California, a slim majority said they wanted a smaller government with fewer services, 51%. Big divide between Democrats and Republicans on that. Among those who were not registered to vote, 70% said they wanted a bigger government with more services. So those trends that we're seeing last year, we're seeing this year, and we saw it 10 years ago. So these are very strong and persistent trends. So as we think about the election that is ahead of us this fall, it's really important to remember that the electorate does not reflect the growth or diversity of the state's population, that decisions that are made through the state's initiative process does not necessarily express the preferences of all adults because the preferences of voters and non-voters are different. I am pleased to see that the legislature has been moving with great purpose since the low turnout in 2014, with a number of electoral process changes and others yet are planned and being discussed. But it's really important to keep in mind that we're not going to see big changes as a result of electoral processes. There are a lot of other major economic and political forces that are at work that will impact the numbers and the types of people who come out to vote in our state's elections. So as well as electoral process changes, the issues that we emphasize in our report, the need to build trust in government, the need to provide civics education, the need to see increased economic mobility in our state, and the need for citizenship drives because of the large numbers of non-citizens, and the need to change federal immigration policies that would bring in more people who are adults living in California into the election process. Let me just mention two other things. One is that one of the reasons that PPIC does polling on all adults rather than registered voters is because of what we're talking about today. Our surveys are designed to inform the legislators about the policies that are needed for Californians, and at the same time inform the legislators and other policymakers about where likely voters stand on issues. So we continue to and will continue to look at that. And one other thing I want to mention, just to bring this into a contemporary time period, is that I watched with interest this last week as SB 1253 was used around the minimum wage initiative. It's an example of the legislature, which has representatives who are tasked with the chore of representing the adults, all adults in their districts, taking up issues that would have otherwise gone to the likely voters in this next election. I will take just one or two questions, maybe one from this side and one from that side because I want to give plenty of time to our panel. So do we have one from this side? Nobody from this side? Does that mean I have to take two from that side?
Yes, it does.
Okay. There's one right back here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can you give any opinion on the Arizona fiasco voting? I mean, there are thousands of people waiting in line, and they didn't get to vote, and they closed the polling.
In the primary, yeah. Well, it's the process issues are a problem, and I think in our state we're trying to do as much as we can around that. And what I'm saying in this report is that there are broader issues about the public's involvement, but definitely you want to avoid problems like that. So one from this side? Yes, there we go.
There are some who would argue that There are some who would argue that lower voter participation is not necessarily a problem. You're clearly addressing it as a problem. So what do you say about that? Because that can affect the willingness to pursue the solutions to a problem they don't necessarily agree with.
Yeah, as somebody who lives in the world of survey samples, this is an easy question for me to answer, because the question is whatever the turnout is it representative of the population at large? And if it's not representative, then it limits the ways that you want to use that. And in this case, I would say, in particular in California, the attention that I'm drawn to is around the initiative process. If we're making decisions about school services, right, and those groups are underrepresented in the policy decision making, would I rather have an unrepresentative group making that decision, or bring that back to a group that's asked to represent all the people? So I should stop now, because we've got a terrific panel. I'll pick up some other questions after. And thank you for all for being here today. And we have a terrific moderator of this panel, John Myers, who's just one of the outstanding journalists in California, and now with the LA Times bureau chief. And John, I'm going to leave this in your trusty hands. Thank you. Thanks.
Trusted hands, that's a frightening way to start. So our folks are coming up here. I'll let them sit down. Thank you. Thanks, Mark, and thanks to the to PPIC for letting me be a part of this. I'm coming in. So good to see you, sir.
Hey, Mindy.
Senator Allen, I saw earlier. I harassed Senator Allen while he was trying to eat in the back. I didn't tweet it out, though. There's no on-the-record moment there. Obviously, our folks here are going to talk a little bit about how they see this. I mean, I've told Mark before we started that when the first study came out that he did in 2006, which I can't believe it's been 10 years since we did that, it has provided the basis for me as a reporter, as a political and government reporter, to ask a lot of questions and write a lot of stories about how the electorate and the public don't match up and that gap between them. And I would have guessed, just anecdotally, that things hadn't changed a lot in 10 years, and then, you know, I'm the bearer of good news here. You look at the report that they put out last night, and you see that there are a lot of these same trends there, that there is this demonstrable gap between who votes and who lives in California. Let me introduce the panel here, and then I'm going to ask everybody maybe kind of one question to get us going, and then we'll wing it from there. What the heck? And then you'll have some questions, hopefully, too, and we've got the microphones that go around. So furthest away from me first is State Senator Ben Allen, who represents California's 26th Senate District, was elected in 2014. So you're a newcomer.
Yeah.
Congrats. And chairs the Senate Elections and Constitutional Amendments Committee. First year, he authored SB 439, which has this mechanism for voting in the 2 weeks preceding an election. He's also a big backer of SB 450, which is about voter turnout. We're going to let him describe that in a moment. I'll ask him to. He has a JD from UC Berkeley and a master's from the University of Cambridge. Next to Senator Allen is Mindy Romero. Mindy is the founder and director of the California Civic Engagement Project at the UC Davis Center for Regional Change. She's also someone who reporters love to call and figure out what the heck is going on. She's a political sociologist whose research focuses on the intersection of political behavior and race and ethnicity, and holds a PhD in sociology from UC Davis. And last but not least, Assemblyman Matthew Harper, who represents California's 74th Assembly District. He is vice chair of the Committee on Elections and served as mayor of Huntington Beach and on the council there as well, and has a BS from the University of Southern California. So all great folks here. See, we had to get that in. Yeah. And I have a degree from UC Berkeley and Duke, and we've all lost in the national championship basketball tournament. Sorry, did I have to get that in? We're not talking about basketball. We're talking about elections. Let me ask everybody a question to start with, if I could. I'm going to actually take you out of order. Mindy, I'm going to go for you first, just because I want to look from the research perspective and then outward to the political impact. Not saying our elected officials don't think about it beyond the politics, but we know that California has had a lot of discussion over the last few years about removing these barriers to voting. But I think, as Mark's report shows, and some of the research you've done too, it's often not just that difficulty in getting to vote. It's the actual motivation. I mean, you know, that the registered voters told the polling team at PPIC, you know, they aren't interested in elections. Eligible adults said they don't trust elections, they don't trust politics, sorry. Looking for the secret sauce, the path forward, how do you view this? Because this is a systemic issue. And then I'll ask the lawmakers as well.
Sure, and I should make sure, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, small mic. I break it down in two ways. We need to make our electoral system, we need to make it easier for folks to vote. That's more of the institutional barriers, some of the reforms that I'm sure we'll talk about today. And then we need to make people want to vote. That's the motivation question. And I think clearly from the report today, we are seeing, and we all have heard, I think, in other venues, more anecdotally certainly, that people are feeling very disconnected from the political process, and they are having difficulty in trusting their government and feeling how it relates to their lives and why it matters to vote and cast a vote and so forth. I think your question is, what's the secret sauce? How can we address
Is there a
that?
secret sauce? But I mean, you know, what is the path, given that we've talked so much about making it easier to vote, but there's a motivational issue?
I think, first off, I think we need to recognize that motivation is very low, and we need to meet voters where they're at. So appeals based on, and you know, I never thought I'd say this, but appeals based on civic duty or voting is important because it makes our democracy stronger. Although true, very true, I think fall flat for a lot of folks that are not voting or are not participating, less likely to vote. And I think recognizing where voters are and then working from that. Ultimately, we need to develop a culture of voting. We don't have a culture. We have a culture of non-voting. It's completely socially acceptable in almost all social circles to not vote. And I think we need to work in areas, and hopefully we'll talk about this more today, but certainly civics education, some of the areas that Mark's report talks about. So civics is really the long game, working with our kids not in high school, but it really in K through 12, all the way through. It's also a key place to diversify the electorate and get to eventually a place where our electorate looks like our population. And certainly socioeconomic factors, and definitely looking still though at targeted outreach and mobilization. It's a key reason why we have such low turnout, and it's a key place to increase turnout. But to make sure that we do that, we target those groups that are historically underrepresented, still underrepresented. It's reforms, it's not rising tide, raises all boats? It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We need reforms, certainly, and we need work and outreach and mobilization, but we need to be making sure that we're specifically also focusing on the unique experiences and needs of underrepresented populations. If we're ever gonna move that needle significantly, that's gonna be a key place too, and I'll leave it there.
Let me, Assemblyman Harper, I may direct the question to you and the Senator this way. You've had a glance, maybe look at the report and some of the conclusions in it and this gap. Going forward, as somebody whose name is on a ballot and who needs people to show up to vote, both actually to have the job and to represent them, what do you see? I mean, it strikes you as the first path forward, and then we'll get into it, of course.
Well, I would agree on both ends, but probably through a slightly different end. I think that the issue, primarily in terms of improving civic engagement, is, and I do appreciate the recognition that civic engagement and voting are not necessarily the same thing. Voting, to me, is just one of the steps in terms of civic engagement. Communicating with your elected officials, communicating with staff of the city, trying to improve things, whether it's your school or whether it's your city. A lot of those things depend on advocacy. A lot of them depend on organization or neighborhood, individual communications and such. And so voting is just one part of the pathway towards strong civic engagement within each of our communities. I'm a believer that we need to make sure to get people involved at a young age in terms of understanding how they can affect government, and that there is actually a cause and effect from the people to their institutions, local, state, and national government. Of course, local can be affected the best. And I think that it's not just our education system, but also there's a role for nonprofits. I was involved in an organization when I was in high school called Junior State, or Junior Statesmen America. And a lot of it was role-playing in terms of how to be involved in government at an older age. Extremely instrumental in terms of my understanding and preparation to be a part at the level that I am. But if more people were engaged in an organization like that, we'd have a much more involved and engaged citizenry. So it's not just government policy. There's also a role in terms of volunteer organizations and nonprofits. On the political side, I would warn that I would say that it's not just the percentage of the voter population that's important. Let's not think that we can go back to the 1800s, for example, where in some cities, say for example New York, where the political system was dominated by Tammany Hall, and you'd sometimes get 200 or 300% turnout because people would show up at the polls. They were brought out by the Tammany machine, and they'd have a full beard at the beginning of the day, and they'd show up at the poll again, and they'd have a goatee, and they'd show up at the polls again, and they'd have a mustache. And then by the end of the day, they were clean shaven by the time they'd voted a few times, because the phrase vote early, vote often is not fiction. It's a part of some parts of our country into the past. And so that, I think, is very important, because there's the need to try to address improvement of voter turnout, but you also have to balance that with ballot integrity, because nothing will disengage our public more than if there's no confidence in the integrity of the ballot. If people perceive that people are abusing or voting more than once, or if people are perceiving that non-qualified people are voting in an election, that discourages the participation of the many, and we can have our democracy fall against itself.
Senator Allen, your thoughts about path forward after looking at the data?
Well, I think that, first of all, I want to give a special shout out to Mark and the PPIC, who have done a really great job of pulling together the evidence that I think is very worrying. I mean, ultimately, we've got a situation where our government and our population are moving off in different directions. And there's this, this wonderful pull quote on page 15 where it talks about how California faces the prospect of an electorate making policy decisions that neglect the realities and problems facing large and growing segments of society. And I think it's an enormous problem because the vibrancy of our civic democracy is at stake. Now, let's throw out some interesting ideas relating to participation. First of all, the one thing I'd say is that the flip side of the argument that Matt just made about voter integrity is also making sure that, I think another thing that would denigrate and detract from people's willingness to engage in the process is if they feel as though there are unnecessary burdens being put in place to prevent them from engaging in the process. And certainly, while I don't think this is, while in California we're moving more and more in a direction toward making voting more convenient, other states seem to be doing whatever they can to throw up as many barriers as possible. And certainly if you look at the history of the country, there, for every Tammany Hall, there's also Mississippi, where the voter turnout, at least with certain portions of the population, were 1%, because effectively you were creating so many laws to prevent black folks from engaging in the process that it was criminal. And that legacy continues to this day in some of those areas. Now, look, I went to Australia in the fall where they have mandatory voting. We went there to learn about their water systems, but it was very interesting to learn about their electoral systems. They literally make it's required that everyone vote. And when you talk to the elected officials, they have to engage with every aspect of society as a result. Sure, you get some people who cast some bizarre votes. I mean, one of the bodies has a proportional representation system. So, the sex party got a couple seats in the legislature, because I'm sure some of the people who someone just applauded for that. That's great.
Well, see, there was actually a bingo game as to what time that would get mentioned. 12:40.
So I'm glad to have enriched you. So yeah, there are some folks who kind of that's their little protest vote of sorts, and but at the same time, it leads to kind of a much greater engagement and much more responsiveness and proactivity on the part of the elected officials to reach out to the broader population. So that's an interesting idea. I've also traveled to Colorado in connection with SB 450, which is my bill that seeks to create a new system where we have vote centers that are open for 10 days before Election Day, and a vote-by-mail system in addition to make it easier for people to vote. And they just tend to have higher turnout in Colorado in general. And part of the thing is that it's a purple state. They're constantly being fought over. And California, for better or for worse, is there's one party that seems to be dominating these days. So maybe if we can convince Matt to get behind folks more like John Kasich rather than the other two we have in their race that are kind of driving their party toward total irrelevance in California, that might help with greater engagement and competition.
It's a slightly
in the
different
state.
issue.
No, but it's a real issue.
Okay.
It's a real issue because the further the Republican Party goes off the deep end from a California perspective, the less competitive they're going to be here in this state, and the more people are going to feel as though their vote doesn't really matter because they're ultimately not being able to participate in a meaningful way in the big dance, in the big game, getting back to your basketball illusions, which is the presidency. Now, another thing I should mention is, I mentioned Australia. This is a country of 25 million people. They've got, I think 5 round-the-clock news channels. They've got, a major national press corps that's constantly reporting on and engaging in their politics. It is pathetic how few reporters we now have here in Sacramento. I mean, it used to be there were 45 full-time correspondents for all the newspapers around the state. I think we're now down to like 14 or 12, in Sacramento. We don't have a 24-hour news channel. Maybe, careful what to wish for, but at the same time, we spend all this time parsing apart the latest details of Donald Trump's, mishegas, and then at the same time, there's enormous stories, enormous, interesting political, cultural, business stories that are happening out throughout the state of California that get so little attention, and it's so hard for us to get interest and attention from our own constituents because even if they are interested in politics, their conversation, their interest is all about Washington, even though there's so much more going on here of real note and interest given all the intransigencies and inability for anything to happen over on the Washington side. So I think having a more engaged media coverage would also make a difference too. So those are some initial thoughts, and I know we'll go on to more.
I'm all for more media coverage. As long as they work in my bureau, I'm starting to learn that at the paper. But Mark mentioned one, and again, I'm just going to throw it open to everybody in the panel from here on out. Mark, in his earlier comments, kind of stole one that I walked in the door with, which was to talk about what's been happening over the last few days in Sacramento, which you all will get to actually cast votes on, and I've just been watching over the last few days. Yeah, well, tomorrow for the Assembly, and then perhaps soon after that for the august upper body.
Yes.
And that's minimum wage.
Yeah.
So we know that we had 2 ballot measures to increase the minimum wage. One qualified last week. One was on its way to gathering signatures. And then we had an agreement reached with the governor and mainly organized labor unions to come up with a minimum wage proposal. But I'm struck by it when we talk about voting and the will of the people and what people get out of it, because the work that Mark and his team have done show that there is a correlation in income and voting. And minimum wage impacts the lowest income Californians. And I'm curious as to whether, I don't know what the question formulate here is, but would it have passed in the ballot measure as it was? There was polling to indicate it. Polls say all kinds of things, all due respect to pollsters. Would it have passed? Should it have passed? Is the deal we've got in the Capitol better? And I don't mean to be getting into the policy of minimum wage. I'm looking at it from the participatory democracy point here. You know, would people have low-income folks have been served better by having the ballot measure, but would they have not shown up? And the electorate being more exclusive, to Mark's point, been more disinclined to vote for a minimum wage increase because they generally have more money. I mean, there's something here to me to the connection of a real-world experiment about what matters to Californians, what impacts their lives, what they want, that's playing out right now.
Well, I mean, there's a reason why labor was pushing to put the measure on the presidential ballot, because ultimately that is the one election where even Californians do turn out. And so I think ultimately the read and the polling showed that this was very likely to pass. It's part of the reason why you don't see the Chamber of Commerce kicking and screaming. They just came out with their list of job killer bills, and this is not on the list.
It is on it.
Okay,
Yes.
all right.
It's because it's a holdover bill from last year.
That's right. You're right. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry.
Media.
But I think. Yeah, I know. Yeah. See, if only I had more news.
I read the article.
But I don't. I think they're gonna oppose it. But they're not gonna kind of have a full frontal assault on it, because I think they see it as being a better alternative to what was going on the ballot. Look, I think ultimately, there's enough things to drive interest on this particular ballot, given all the things that are going to be there, all the different propositions, the presidential, et cetera. I do think that what makes a big difference for poorer folks is convenience, ultimately, because they're more likely to not have the kind of extra time. The old system where you only vote on one day. If your kid gets sick, or you have something, you got to stay late at work, or the bus comes late, all of a sudden you can't make it to the polling location. And having a system in place where you can actually cast a vote conveniently 10 days before Election Day could really make a difference. And we've seen that play out in Colorado and elsewhere.
But let me tell you, so Assemblyman Harper, I'm going to take a wild guess here that you're probably not a yes vote for the proposal tomorrow.
You must have read that I have more no votes than anyone in the Assembly.
I did, so let me write that down. Well, what I was going to ask you is, would you have rather had the voters who are going to show up in November decide this issue? Would that have been more representative of Californians in your mind? I mean, again, when I'm going back to the lens here of what the electorate, who the electorate is, and what Californians care about, and whether there is a difference or symmetry there, I'm just curious. I mean, would you have felt better?
So you do bring a good question in terms of what's the appropriate responsibility of the legislature and what's appropriate to deal with through ballot initiative. And the one thing that's important to understand as a distinction between the two is that if something needs to be changed, if something needs to be tinkered with, to be able to actually respond to current economic situations or current realities, is the legislature can act anytime within the legislature's session. That's great news for some. The legislature's in session almost all the time with a full-time legislature here in California. We're not like other states where it's part-time, maybe only for odd-numbered years. And so the legislature can respond to changes if indeed this is a disaster. You don't need to put it on the ballot again. One of the things that is always a part of trying to figure out what's the best approach is, do I like questions being decided by the people? Tend to say yes. But there's sometimes the question is, how is it framed? Is it the right way to be able to ask a question? Because a minimum wage increase can be structured in 50, 100, or 1,000 different ways. Is it scheduled to all happen at once? Is it scheduled to happen over 3 years? Or in this proposal, one of the things in both the ballot initiative as well as what I understand as legislation is it actually takes it out of the legislature's hands to be able to revisit every few years like we've been doing for the last couple of decades, and it puts an automatic increase on the end of it. So the current proposal isn't just to have it increase to $15, it's to have it increase indefinitely according to inflation, and it wouldn't decrease if we had a recession.
And I don't want to get too far into the policy, but I understand your point. But Mindy, this is the way I was going to ask you to approach this. I mean, isn't this an issue? How much people who are at the lowest end of the wage scale get paid that maybe would generate people to come out and get engaged in the electoral process in a way. And again, I'm not asking you to weigh on the policy. I'm talking about what motivates people to be part of the process, to participate.
Sure, and I actually have a lot of thoughts on this. First off, just to your point, Senator, regarding the upcoming election, November election, I think we also need to recognize that not only do we have higher turnout, but you also have a more diverse electorate. And policymakers are very aware of that. So it's going to have a higher proportion of lower income folks, still underrepresented, of Latinos, of folks that would be interested in this topic. And I do think that anytime that we have ballot initiatives, anytime we have candidates, anytime we have an issue in an election that people feel connected to, it increases the likelihood that we'll see higher turnout. And minimum wage is something that could bring a lot of people out. But I think this whole discussion is really a political calculation based on the realities of what we've been talking about today in terms of understanding the differences between what the populace wants, what adults want, what likely voters want, and what non-voters want. So because this is something that is perceived to be popular among many folks, and it probably would pass, now we see in the legislature people coming together and many entities, right, that would normally oppose a minimum wage hike or be very concerned about it, willing to make a compromise, willing to forge a deal that they feel is better than the ballot initiative. Right, I think it extends that out a little bit further and so forth in terms of time, because they know that they have to worry about the voters actually passing it. But the flip side of that, somewhat, is we see many issues, right, that maybe that maybe the general populace are interested in, but likely voters are not as interested in, and then there isn't a compromise around that because folks can let that go to the ballot. Right, or maybe not come up in the legislature in a serious fight because they know that they don't have to worry about that. That gap is something that drives decision making and policy making.
There is some, I think,
makes sense?
Yeah, but I think I've talked to you, or I know this has come up in other discussions where I think you've been around. There is some bit of a vicious cycle problem with just talking to likely voters, right? Because then you only keep having the same people turn out. They're the only people who campaigns and politicians reach out to.
Exactly. Right. So on any given election, I mean, we need to be mobilizing, right, and reaching out to the folks that aren't likely voters, the folks that don't vote, and we need to be breaking that cycle.
That costs money, though.
It costs money, and it is more time intensive. Research shows that it does work when you reach out in a more more of a deep connection, and you take the time. You don't just put a door hanger on a door, but you actually knock on the door. You go inside. If you talk to the abuela, whatever, you talk to the family. It works. And people turn out, but our campaign process is driven by the likely voter model, by strategic calculations, by and large, with all due respect to the gentleman here on either side of me. It's driven by the strategic calculations around how to win, of course, and how to best spend limited resources. And so those limited resources go to the folks that are going to be the biggest bang for your buck.
Does that likely voter model trouble either of you, Senator, Assemblyman? I mean, the fact that you just keep talking to the people who are already your people and therefore expanding the pie doesn't necessarily happen?
Look, it's about us trying to maximize our resources, right? You know, we've got a certain amount of money that you have in a campaign coffer, and so you're going to focus on the likely voters because you know those are the ones you're really truly fighting over. Now, of course, all that being said, this presidential election shows the flip side of that, right? Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders are actually driving whole new populations to the polls that folks have not traditionally reached out to and engaged with, and so. You know, and they're going to be forces to be reckoned with both in the June election and the November election. And in fact, I think it's actually it's going to create all sorts of interesting uncertainties for a lot of political consultants because there are going to be a lot of people turning up who the traditional consultants don't know how to deal with or don't even know who they are. And so you know, things are getting mixed up a little bit. You know, it's part of the reason why there's been such a push to try to consolidate elections. Among some people, and you know, there's SB 415, I think, that just passed Ben Wessler's bill that is now going to make it so that you know, that off-cycle elections that have less than 25%, you know, up to more than 25% lower turnout than the general elections will now have to get consolidated into general elections when all these new people are turning out. So it's almost like the tale of two elections, right? There's some cycles where there's relatively low turnout and it all becomes about this likely voter outreach campaign. And then there's the presidential, when it's actually kind of this rather scary but exciting set of opportunities to reach out to new sections of the electorate that are getting turned on by the excitement that now are going to have, that you're now trying to attract down ballot.
And so, you know, as someone who had a very interesting and sometimes different experience, in my election, I was not outspent 2-1. I was not outspent 3-1. I was just outspent by about 5-1 by my opponents. So being able to defeat big money can be done. It can be done by a lot of walking, knocking, and talking, and personally contacting people within your district. It's hard to do in our state legislative districts. It's one thing that we need to keep in mind. In the state assembly, each of us represent more people than any lower house legislative district, the entire nation. And it does take money to be able to communicate to folks. And you are correct in terms of targeting where mail goes, et cetera. When you have a campaign that was very limited like mine, of course you spend that money communicating to people who dependably show up to vote within elections. But it's also a part of having a tiered strategy in terms of being able to target to those some of your message to those people who also vote, but also have a broader message, communicating through the media, communicating through the press, utilizing new social media, which is one of the lowest cost ways to be able to communicate with the voters. I'm, of course, very concerned with the amount of turnout that we have within the state of California. But one thing I also keep in mind is, as I said, some people have their civic engagement in other ways, and some people choose to not participate in some ways. And one of the ways that I'm very concerned about is how many people in California over the last few decades have walked with their feet. They've decided to give up on California and move from our state to other states, in large part because the economic system isn't meeting their ability to be able to get jobs and moving to places. My sister-in-law's moved to Texas, Arizona, Nevada, and other things. And so I'm not just concerned about our voter participation rate here. I'm also concerned about how many people have given up on California.
So let me, sorry.
I'm just going to add, and I certainly hear what you're saying about the uniqueness of November. And it is going to throw off, it's going to create a lot of additional.
And June to some extent, too.
And June, yes, as well. Yeah. It's going to add, I think, additional campaign consultant fees are going to be flying everywhere. But and Senegales are going to be hired. How do we do this? But in general, though, when we're talking presidential elections, it still is the likely voter model, and I just want to make sure that that's really understood and emphasized that. When it's a presidential election, if you have a savvy campaign, you then then maybe analyze your voter files, and you figure out the folks that voted presidentials but don't vote in midterms maybe, and you reach out to them. But there's still a whole segment that never even get touched, even in a presidential election. And the other point I was going to make was there is a very big cavern at times between civic engagement more broadly and voter turnout, but at the same time, there are great disparities in civic engagement participation in the state as well, and the folks that are more likely to engage, particularly in the more traditional forms, like talking to city council and working with your city council member and being part of neighborhood associations and things like that. The more formal forms are more difficult for many groups that are underrepresented to access and to feel relevant to their lives or the realities of their lives. So I just want to point that out too. And so that's also a cavern, and that means that it isn't that, well, they're not voting, but they can do these other things. People are excluded on both fronts.
I feel really compelled to ask the two elected officials this question. We were talking about people being interested in elections and what's going on this particular cycle, but we also if you look at one of the trends that everybody in this room knows about, is that more and more Californians are deciding to unplug for their political party affiliation. They are becoming unaffiliated with a political party. And in some ways, I wonder if there's not a correlation, and maybe there's not, and it's just a reporter musing in the lunch hour, but if there's some kind of correlation between this disengagement, this unwillingness to vote, and the way the parties have conducted themselves, quite frankly, the political parties, and the way the dialogue gets played. Some people choose to not affiliate. Some people just probably choose not to vote. I mean, is there something there that the political parties themselves need to look in the mirror and say, we're part of the problem?
I think one of the issues that's definitely was a process that seemed to be intended to reduce the amount of registration was Proposition 14, which is the top two system in terms of electing people to legislature and to the governor. If you don't have to be a member of either party or any party to actually determine the nominees of the party, then what incentive is there to actually vote for to register for one party or another? And the thing that we have an experiment that we're going to see over the next about 2.5 months is there is a difference in your presidential primaries. The Democratic Party, of course, has almost 2/3 of the legislature, as a dominant situation in terms of their membership within this state, allows for declined to state voters to be able to vote in their primary. They feel that that's their way that they want to approach a presidential election. But for Republicans, the organizational principle is that in order to be able to have a decision on who California sends its delegates for to the National Convention, you actually have to be a registered Republican. It's the only closed primary that we still have within the state of California. So what we'll see over these next couple of months, if people want to make a decision between Donald Trump, John Kasich, or Ted Cruz, you got to vote, or you got to register to vote to be a Republican. You've got to do it by by May 23rd. And so we'll still see, because otherwise, whether you choose to register one party or not, outside of the presidential cycle, it doesn't matter. And what it's actually going to do is it's going to probably increase the cost of campaigns by producing significant databases because the reality is, even if you register no party preference, everybody has a party preference. If you're voting 100 times, you're going to vote for a Democrat more often than a Republican, or Republican more often than a Democrat.
I think my question more is the way the parties have conducted themselves, either in specific instances or in broad instances. Is there any culpability at all from the party universe? I mean, I've got an 8-year-old daughter who watches the presidential debates and says, why are they all yelling at each other? And I try to explain to her the importance of voting, and I can already see at 8, she's watching what's going on in the current universe of being a father as a reporter, a political reporter, and me trying to talk about why her mother and I vote, and I wonder if there's not a glimmer of something there. And so I just wonder about the way politics plays out. I know the senator wants to say, but since I asked you, I interrupted. Go ahead.
I'll briefly address that. I think a lot of it is because, for better or worse, the media often focuses on the worst of us. When you had 3 state senators who were convicted in the last session, it's not a positive thing on members of either party in the current situation. I think when there's such a negative light that's portrayed on people that hold office, whether it's the majority.
You don't think they brought that on themselves?
I think that's a big part of the issue, is that we need to do better in terms of vetting candidates. We need to abandon folks who aren't up to the standards of engaging in public life. There's a few folks that are bad apples, and it's a part of the parties to be able to vet them. Back when I was on the school board, for the city. The teacher union, one of the good things they did is they actually used to, before the tenure period, they would try to weed out the folks who wouldn't end up making good teachers. We probably got to work on making sure to weed out on the party level the folks who don't make good elected officials.
Senator, I know you.
I mean, I think we have to talk about structures. Parties are, for better or for worse, reflections of, responsive to both our broader society, societal trends, and also the structures that determine who ends up in power positions. So, let's talk about the way that we elect our elected officials who end up being the party leaders at the national level. You end up having our nation divvied up, for the most part, into hyper-partisan districts for the House of Representatives. And then you hand the decision for who gets elected within that already hyper-partisan district to the most, to just the partisan voters within the partisan primary in those districts. So you've basically isolated the effective deciders of who gets elected to Congress into this small little pot of hyper-partisan people. So it's no wonder that the folks who end up getting elected through that process end up being responsive to that small group of people. The presidential election, to a lesser extent, doubles down on that issue. It's not quite as extreme as at the national, as is in Congress, but ultimately, it's particularly given all the emphasis placed on these caucuses, which are minuscule portions of the population voting, and yet, our people who want to run for president end up running around this little rural state of Iowa for 2 years, talking about ethanol subsidies and eating a lot of beef, and
It's a beautiful state.
It's a beautiful state, and that's great, and that's great. But ultimately, it does not reflect America. It doesn't reflect the diversity of America, and the folks who are actually making the decisions don't even reflect the diversity of their own state, right? So this is the system we now have that are producing the very party leaders that end up engaging in the sort of partisanship and the bickering that you're talking about, because ultimately there are no incentives for them to try to attract a broad base of the population that ultimately I think is crying out for bipartisanship and moderation. I mean, if you look at the number of people who are turning off to the parties, it's because they don't want to see the extremes. So one of the things we have to start doing as a nation is trying to create more structures that will allow for those people who can message to a broader portion of the population to actually succeed in the system. Now, we've solved some of those problems here in California. The jury's still out on how Top 2 and how the new redistricting system will work, but certainly nationally, and of course it is ultimately Washington. We even here in our elected officials here in Sacramento, we live and die by the conversation nationally because that's where all the attention is placed. Nationally, the system is so stilted because of the way that we select our leaders.
The questions are coming to you folks soon, but Mindy, jump in.
Yeah, so very impassioned, and I agree with everything you said. What I think I would say, this brings us back to, this isn't just about, of course, why people are voting no party or choosing no party preference, but this brings us back to the original question of how do we motivate people to vote, and why are people not feeling motivated to vote, and kind of meeting people where they're at. It's not that potential voters and non-voters are delusional or just need to be better informed, or we just need to show them the way. But if they're feeling disconnected because there's a reason. They see money in politics, they see partisanship, they see fighting, particularly our young people. They grew up, if you're a millennial, or particularly if you're 18 to 24, you grew up watching the government being shut down. When you watch TV, now nobody watches TV, but when you were younger,
Well, you grew up with Bush, Gore, and shutdowns and recalls.
Every year the government being shut down, right? And we could talk about the media impact and the changing media on why, in the narrowcast world, why it's becoming even more difficult, why things are more hyperpolarized, but we don't have time for that. The other thing I wanted to add, though, is either way, we see this tremendous growth. We could talk about all the reasons why we get there, but the end result is that we do see this big growth in the percent of those that are registered nationally, but here in California, as MPP, no party preference, the old decline to state, right, 24% or so of registered voters. And I do think there's a self-selection process, but the question is, what do those voters do? And we know that this is another factor why turnout is low, because if you're registered as MPP, you are less likely, for that factor alone, to turn out to vote. Voter turnout rates for those registered as MPP are typically at least 10 percentage points lower than those that are registered as a party. And that's not looking at demographic factors and things, but just that designation alone. They are more disconnected, they're self-selected into that, but they're all also by definition then now not as connected to a political party, and they're not part of a political party, and they don't get that outreach and mobilization. And even though parties are figuring out how to get to them and consultants are figuring out how to get to them, it's still an additional difficulty, additional step.
Do you think it's possible, just really quickly, do you think it's possible in my journalist hypothesis that I've just come up with, that there might be some kind of correlation to the detachment that people have and this group of voters who somehow don't show up with as much frequency, aren't touched by the parties in the same way? I mean, maybe they actually have become the part that everybody wants. I mean, is there any possibility? I'm not saying that there's any data yet, but is it potential? Because you're describing a group of people who are somewhat less engaged in some way, have chosen to be. I don't know.
So you're wondering if they're less engaged because they're feeling
I don't know. Maybe
detached.
they are closer cousins to their non-voting Californians than the others.
Yeah, well, it's
Just
difficult
come up with a
because there's-
family. We're one
in terms
family.
of data, because things are so complicated. But I think certainly for many of the folks that choose NPP, they are turned off by the party system. They are less trusting of government, those sorts of things. All the factors that go into why they end up not voting, or they're less likely to vote, that gets complicated. But certainly you can make a case, and many have, that it seems logical that they are less likely to vote because of that influence.
So-
from that.
Can I make a quick observation on
Very
parties?
quick, because I want to get questions, and I got a grenade question to throw and then get off the stage.
So one thing that I've very much been able to do is about 4 years ago, I was able to go to Korea. And a part of it was to learn about their political system and their government and other things. And one thing that I learned in Korea is they have a similar democracy, but in terms of their parties, what they do is they treat their parties as disposable. Every new presidential candidate has a new party. And it's a great way of saying we're brand new. Those other guys, those were in the past, and they
Rebranding?
disavow the people. And the thing that I find with a lot of people who say that they're no party preference is they're people who don't want to take responsibility for people who share their political perspective. They've seen a lot of the negative folks. I mean, it's really easy. All these presidential candidates, while they have a big machine for them, they also have big machines against them. They're called super PACs or their opponents. And so it's really easy to be embarrassed by these folks who are like that. And so in the party system, I think all of us carry the baggage. Every Republican carries the baggage of everyone all the way to Lincoln that people may or may not have had a gripe with. And similarly with Democrats for decades and decades. And that's, I think, a part of the issue is people don't have the perspective of these are institutions over time.
So you all were so good on the other issues that I didn't get to the grenade question until now. So it's going to be short. I've moderated panels before. It's like the 60-second question. I'm sorry, gentlemen. Ding, ding. But here it is,
Gentlemen.
because I want the audience to be able to ask their
Ladies and
questions.
gentlemen.
Well, I have a feeling, I want to see what they say before the academic. I'm going to let, these are you're right in between, Mindy. It's the poll,
I'm in between two honorable men.
Somewhat.
Well, Assemblyman Harper is to your left, Senator Allen's to your right. It's a very
can't read
strange
the
world.
signs.
Okay, so here's my, all right, enough humor. Here's the question, and I just want to put it out there because it comes up in this discussion about who votes and who doesn't a lot, and I think one of the folks in the audience may have actually almost touched on it with Mark, and I was like, that's my question. So here it is. There is this sense sometimes that people will argue that it's better to have a small and informed electorate than a large and uninformed one. People will say, well, I don't want those stupid people voting, that maybe we're better off with a small electorate. Politicians first, and then Ms. Romero. 60 seconds. Who wants to go?
I'll go ahead. I think the issue is just as I talked about at the beginning. It's about making sure that we engage people as young adults and as kids, and you will help make people be better stewards of their own democracy as they grow into it. Instead of trying to focus so much on one side, I think there's an argument to be made for let's improve our demographics. The more homeowners that there are in the state of California, the more people who are likely to vote, who really truly have a stake in the game because they want to make sure that the state where their property is does well. And so if we improve demographics of people, if we help people to opportunity so that they're doing better economically, so that they own more, so that they have a greater stake in our democracy, that I think more people will be able to take it seriously. And I think that's the part of the equation to take it.
Good. Senator Allen.
Yeah, I think it's better to have a large and informed electorate, and ultimately, I think that's a.
That wasn't the choice you
No,
were
I know,
given.
but you know what? I think it's a false dichotomy.
Fair enough.
My concern is that that question presupposes a fatalism that is not good for our nation. It's not good for our sense of civic optimism, and So I think it's part of it's what Matt mentioned, the economic opportunity. Part of it's about our school system and our education system. Part of it's about about creating better infrastructure for young people to grow and thrive and be able to engage in meaningful ways without fear and without without deprivation. So it's part of the work that we all do in government, trying to make things better for people.
Professor Romero, you get to bring it home. You've no doubt heard this before.
Of course, yes. And giving 60 seconds to an academic is like.
Welcome to broadcasting, which I used to be.
And I have to also add one other thing when you're asking me the question about the independent voters or the NPP voters. Of course, that growth is driven by young people because young people are overwhelmingly or disproportionately NPP, and they're also less likely to vote. But I'll leave that with you. Getting to your question, I think we can't go there. When you start talking about this relationship between, well, we want if we have a large expanded electorate, they're not informed of which is better. We have a very long history in this country of talking about essentially the worthiness of voters and trying to assess whether folks are informed enough or qualified enough, have enough of a stake in the game. We literacy tests, poll tax. Young people today get it still all the time. Well, it's too bad if young people aren't voting, but maybe it's that they were better off anyway because wait till they pay taxes and have a stake in the game and are more informed. So that's a very slippery slope. Yes, I want an informed and expanded electorate, but when we start trying to weigh and put a judgment on the qualifications of a voter, that's where that gets used, those markers get used as measures or as tools to exclude. So it's a dangerous topic that we shouldn't go into lightly in that sense. So.
But it comes up often, so I just wanted to make sure
yes, I understand. Yeah.
pull the pin out of that one. Okay, some questions in the audience. There are microphones if you'll wait for them. There's one microphone rolling its way there. Sir, I'm going to let you go first because you had your hand up first. You were fast.
I feel like there's almost an elephant in the room here in that there are a couple of candidates presidentially that have really motivated a lot of votes. And those are probably Trump and Sanders. And so I'm just wondering what you might pull. I have my own feelings about what are good ways of motivating people, but what can you take from those candidates and say that legislators or aspiring holders of office in California might be able to learn from those two, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with their policies?
I'm going to say that I would add at least one of the presidential candidates to that list, and that's Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz, because he's a philosophically consistent conservative.
And you're a supporter of Mr. Cruz.
And I'm an early supporter, if it sounds obvious. But he helps attract a lot of people to the ballot box who would normally be disillusioned by many of the presidential candidates. People who are maybe consistent pro-faith, pro-life voters, who are sometimes disappointed by a lot of the candidates being wishy-washy or going back on previous promises, are very turned on with that campaign or indeed engaging in the process, especially in high effort contests such as caucuses. And so I would argue that I think the bigger issue is that the candidate with so many institutional advantages and so much cash that it's also interesting how poorly they're doing given their extreme advantages. Hillary Clinton on one side, and I would also argue that for Republicans, Jeb Bush, with so many advantages, just fell absolutely flat. So the electorate continues to surprise, but one thing that I think is important to remember is that the presidential process is a very indirect process that involves delegates, that involves an electoral process. And I think often we put too much of an emphasis on presidential politics when we have more direct influences on our republic, such as our races for Congress, our races for legislature, governor, and especially local office.
if I can get more, if you feel like you want to jump in, I don't want to cut. I just want to be mindful that people have all kinds of things to talk about.
I can say something,
Okay.
I think briefly.
This is the 30-second one. This is the rebuttal
Good,
minute.
good. I need to be challenged. There's lots that we could say about what's happening with both of those candidates and campaigns. But one thing I'll mention, just again, kind of getting back to today and discussion of different policy preferences. And so both of those candidates, like it or not, are talking about things that many of the folks that are supporting them, they say that they don't hear in our typical political structure, and they don't hear from typical campaigns. And that's exciting people. They feel like it's speaking to their issues. If you're Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump supporter, speaking to them and speaking to their issues and their language. And so in general, political science literature will tell us, the more, and also more media attention around that too, but when folks feel there's a stake in the game, right, they're much more likely to get out there and vote. So that's, in absence of hearing things that resonate with us, right, we see lower turnout. So.
Other questions?
And the one thing, just
sorry.
authenticity. I think voters are hungry for that, and I think that's part of that's at the heart of what you're asking.
Yeah. Sir?
Hi, thank you very much for this panel. It's very enjoyable. This is more of an observation than a question. But to start, my grandfather came to this country as a young man, 1902. And one of the things that he was one of the most exciting experiences for him, and also one of the most disappointing, he was able to vote for Eugene Debs 3 times for president. And he always regretted that he couldn't vote in 1900 when he ran the first time. He only came here in 1902. But he voted, like me, in every single election. Now, this will date me a bit, but I'm one of those people who gets out, makes phone calls and walks the neighborhoods, knocks on doors. I've been doing that for 50 years in every single election, primary and general. And what I have discovered, and I've been a lobbyist, a political director, I've been a deputy campaign manager, and one of the things that I have seen is what motivates people to vote is issues. Not the candidates per se, but the issues. So for example, this year, the most important issue that I have seen when I talk to people is the composition of the Supreme Court. And we want to have a president who will be able to make an informed decision on who will be appointed to the Supreme Court. So for me and for many people I've talked to, that is the issue this year. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions, thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'm wondering about the amount of cynicism there is about campaign finance and all the high donors, the dark money, and whether or not public financing of campaigns, which incentivizes elected officials to actually talk to their constituents and reflect what those values are, would make a difference. Thank you.
In theory, that they wouldn't have to raise money, they would just, yeah.
Or small matching funds,
Right.
et cetera.
Anyone want to jump in?
Even though the issue on publicly financed campaigns, you start to ask, I'm sure there's a significant part of the voting population who would say, would you want to be taxed to pay for Donald Trump's campaign? There's a lot of people who would probably say, no, I'm not interested in getting taxed for Donald Trump's campaign. And that also extends to a lot of people who various folks for various different reasons. And so there's an imperfect way to be able to raise the resources, to be able to communicate with the population. It's not a bad thing to communicate, whether it's issues, whether it's your qualifications, whether it's your platform, but it is very necessary to pay for the public dialogue, to pay for the printing and postage that it takes to get the message out. It's important that we don't just simply randomly select people on the ballot. It's based upon communications that candidates are able to project to the voters to be able to contrast themselves with their opponents.
Yeah, but then how do they get the money to put the word out, and what sort of, what kind of compromises they need to make to be able to get that money? Let me say 2 things that are potentially totally contradicting. Let's look at, so there are some interesting stories from this year and certainly from recent history that actually suggest that maybe money doesn't play as big a role as we all thought. Donald Trump, the guy's a gazillionaire, but he doesn't seem to spend anything, and yet he's been, running out ahead. Though part of his appeal, of course, is this sense of him being independent from all the big money, because he's so financially independent. Similarly, with Bernie Sanders, started out with very little money. Now, of course, has attracted a lot of small donations, and he's been able to grow as a result. But but over and over again, big spenders have actually ended up being rejected by the voters. Certainly here in California, Meg Whitman and Huffington, and Carly Fiorina. I mean, there have been a number of these examples on the Democratic side as well.
Al Checky,
exactly.
Steve Wesley.
Oh,
sorry.
So it's absolutely it goes in both directions,
Bipartisan.
and so there is a sense sometimes of people not liking a sense of elections, trying to, Jeb Bush, of course, at the national level. I mean, they spent something like, what was it, $10,000 a vote in Iowa? I mean, just obscene. Now, the flip side is that's for kind of high-profile races. That's sort of, the presidency, U.S. Senate, governor. At the local level or for the state legislature, it's just hard to break. It's hard to break into the conversation. I'm very supportive of public financing. Though of course the voters have, for some of the reasons that Matt just articulated, have rejected public financing over and over again. There was the CNA, the California Nurses Association, put on I think a really interesting measure back in, I think, 2006 that would have had a robust public financing system, and it was rejected 4-1. Now, one thing we can do, I've got a bill on this actually right now, SB 1107, which basically allows for public financing if states or locals want to do it. Right now, there's actually a ban under the PRA on public financing that would have to be overturned. And so this bill seeks to overturn that ban so that you could allow locals, if they wanted to, or to have a local group put on the ballot some sort of measure that would allow for a public financing system. Because I do think ultimately it's so important to allow for a little bit of a cleanup. The distinction I'm going to make with the national campaigns is that as a new person who's not personally wealthy, it's basically impossible to break into the popular consciousness unless you have a little bit of money to be able to pummel people with your mail and your face and your name ID. And where do you get that money? And ultimately, it's from people who have an interest in the process. And I think that ends up becoming very ethically, morally challenging for our system. And I think it does breed cynicism.
I'm going to go to. Sorry, Kelly's telling me there's a person back there, and then ma'am, I'll come back to you after that.
So it seems that most of the solutions offered have been around either increasing motivation to vote or decreasing barriers to voting. Just curious what kind of research has been done on non-voters. Is it a motivation issue more or a barrier issue? Is it both? And specifically, what barriers or motivations?
I think I heard everything. It's both. The problem is that they're very intertwined, right? So, and just also recognizing that. So earlier when I said we have to make it easier for people to vote and we have to make them want to vote. Both of those are connected in many, many ways. So I think and we could remove, just about every barrier that we could think of, and we still won't see, in the US at least, and here in California, we won't see turnout rates near other established democracies. I'm sure everybody here knows that we have one of the lowest turnout rates amongst established democracies in the world. Significantly lower. So we have to work on the motivation part of it. I think one thing that gets a little lost in the motivation conversation, which now thankfully is I think we're shining the light on it, we're talking about it a lot more, but sometimes it can be a dangerous path too, because we'll talk about motivation and then there's an assumption underlying it, or it leads to people thinking that it's really just apathetic voters. If you have to motivate them to vote, it must mean they don't care, right? It must mean, how do you deal with that?
Or they're happy with the way it is.
They're happy with the way it is, or whatever.
Well,
and I think that we do know from lots of research that that's not the case, and and then people, particularly our young people, get this rap that they're not voting in terribly, really low numbers if you're 18 to 24. They must just not give a darn, and it's just the opposite. Survey research certainly has pointed out that they care very much. They're pretty darn informed, and they care very much about the world. This is a volunteer generation. They're doing a lot of things. They're willing to be taxed for things they care about. But there's not that, they don't see the connection to voting on the issues they care about. Why should I cast a ballot? What does that mean?
Right.
I'd rather go out and physically be active on something. So it's the motivation part is just absolutely critical, and tackling it
Right. It totally is critical, though I will say the
Really
structures
quickly,
do
if you
matter.
could, just because I don't want to lose these
Just
folks.
look at this season, right? I mean, look at the numbers turning out at caucuses. Look at the numbers turning out at primaries. There's a dramatic difference, and a caucus ends up just you have to be there for a 3-hour period on a particular night. Just far fewer people participate. And in this exact same election, you look at state to state to state, the numbers bear that out.
Okay, so I have 2 folks who want to ask a question. We'll try to maybe have 1 panelist on answering each. Ma'am, you're first, and then you'll get the last question there.
I'm really curious. There seems to be a lot of talk around wanting to get more voters to vote, or people to vote. But like when I was in Peru, you have to vote or you lose your license.
Compulsory voting.
Yes. So what's wrong with that? I mean, what's the reluctance to saying you have to vote? And if you don't vote, then there'll be a repercussion of, whatever. I mean, it just seems to me like there's not anyone taking an aggressive stake to get people to vote except candidates who feel like they won't win with what they have.
So one of you on compulsory voting, if I could, and then I'll go to our last question. Yes, sir.
The big issue there is that in this country, we have the freedom to vote, and the freedom to vote includes the freedom not to vote. We don't have compulsory situations because a part of what our government was found on, if you look at the Constitution, is a government limiting document. And there are plenty of people who don't want to participate in the government, and if they want to choose to do so, that's their freedom to choose to do so. Even if we think that's a completely alien point of view, people still have the right to be able to do that.
All I'll say is that in Australia and Peru, you can cast a blank ballot if you want. You have to go vote, but you don't have to cast it for somebody.
Well, that would be interesting, but that's another. Okay, yes, ma'am.
So my question is regarding I know you guys were talking about civic duty being more involved, but for someone like myself, I'm a college student, I work 2 jobs, and I'm a single mother. I would like to be able to get my voice out on issues that I'm concerned with, but I feel like I don't have time. And I'm a recent voter, so I've only voted for maybe 2 or 3 years now, because prior to that, I come from a low-income background. We weren't reached out to. I didn't know how the process worked and how much my voice does matter, if it does.
Mindy, you want to? Maybe you.
I didn't know if they were going to.
Education.
Well, in your case, it's sounding like you are voting now and you have been voting for a while. So for you, it might be the part of the conversation about making it easier to vote. So reforms around opening up the time that you have to actually get out to the ballot, because you get home after work and you've got kids and you're exhausted, and how do I physically just get to the polling place, right? Or maybe I'm just too damn tired to go vote, right? Particularly if you're feeling low motivation, but even if you have that motivation. So I think for folks that already have the motivation, but they're having difficulty with the realities of their lives, we really need to focus on trying to make it as easy as possible. Period. And then also, again, connecting those dots so that when you vote, my vote, you feel, and you have confidence and trust that your vote matters. So damn it, it's worth it if I go out and vote, because I know that I'm having a say in the process, and I feel even more committed to that.
And it's just interesting in wrapping here that what I hear people talk about so much when we talk to these subjects, I think of 3 things. One is access, which can be legislation and changing the process. One of them is information, and that's everybody, including those of us in the press. And the other one is passion, which is civics, and which is like being part of democracy and being part of the narrative. So I mean, those 3 things just seem so interesting as we talk about this, and whatever that mix is. And I said secret sauce at the beginning, but we don't know completely what it is. So great conversation. Thanks to the experts here. Thanks to all of you. Thanks.